Hello again. We're here for the Network of Biblical Storytellers International Festival Gathering online, and this is our second session. I'm Sarah Agnew, and in the first session I introduced you to embodied performance analysis, a way of interpreting the Bible through the tools of body, emotion and audience. And we looked at an interpretation of Micah 6, 1-8 by using that process. What I'm going to do in sessions 2 and 3 is take the principles of that and those tools and see if we can use them to explore how we create holistic embodied experiences of worship, devotion, and how we tell our story as a way of telling the story of God. So this session is we're going to look at worship and devotion. For me, all that we do in gathered worship, whether it's reading or telling, preaching, singing, even to some extent praying, is proclamation, or at least expression of an encounter with the story of God. Each of these elements of worship in their different ways interpret the Bible and invite engagement with it and reflection on it by our people in order to evoke our worship and to equip and encourage and inspire us to go out into the world and live the story. The question before us for this first part of our second keynote is how in all the elements of gathered worship do we invite deep engagement with the story with and for embodied performance. In this session, we're going to engage with the two types of embodied performance I mentioned in the introductory session. So a reminder that we have embodied performance analysis with the capital letters, which, as we discovered in session 1, is a method for interpretation and discussion. And we have embodied performance with lowercase letters, which is our lived enacting of the story. Preacher, teller, presider, when attending to the body, emotion and audience in preparation for our gathered worship, invite a holistic engagement with it for themselves and the congregation. How might we apply the principles of embodied performance analysis to shaping worship for our communities? Now, I think not every week, perhaps, but from time to time, we might step back and reflect using the tools of embodied performance analysis to see how we are inviting our whole selves into worship and asking how our bodies are engaged in worship, or our emotions, or our relationality. Now, again, in the materials that you'll find on the Network of Biblical Storytellers website, the Festival Gathering page, you'll find the slides that I'll be using in this session. And also there's a guide to applying embodied performance analysis principles to worship. And I encourage you to take that and use it with your congregations, with your leaders, to reflect on your worship. So we begin with considering how our bodies are engaged in worship. Well, we sit, we stand, we speak, we sing, we celebrate baptism and the Eucharist almost incidentally using our bodies, don't we? So how might we intentionally draw attention to our bodies and the ways that we are physically worshipping God? How might we pray with our bodies? Could we share the elements of communion differently from time to time? If you change up your practice, you not only draw attention to your body because you're doing something new and perhaps unfamiliar, but then you also invite reflection on what your usual rituals and practices are and what you appreciate about them. Have you ever used a tree branch to scatter the water from the font as an invitation to the people to remember their baptism when you celebrate this sacrament? I did so once in the rain in a park in summer in Adelaide. What could you do to change the people's entrance into the worship space? Physically change how they enter the building, which door they use, or create a different path in? And in what ways might we draw our attention to the physical space in which we worship, the signs and the symbols that are present within that space, and the stories that they tell? Could you invite the people to use their voices differently, perhaps breaking up into conversation during worship, or into small groups to pray? Could they participate in dramatic tellings or responsive readings? Might the people sit when they normally stand, or stand when they normally sit? Again, changing up our practice in order to reflect on it. I used movement in some Good Friday services to tell the story differently, even not using words at times during the story. One time we brought a cloak and the crown of thorns into the worship space as music played at the point of the story when Jesus is mocked. And we passed the crown and the cloak on one each on each side of the worship space, between the people, down the rows and over the rows, so that the people held these items in their hands. And by doing so, they tangibly entered the story. They became the ones who gave this to Jesus. They became the ones who mocked him with their actions. Then at the point in the story when Jesus dies, we draped the large cross that was in the middle of the gathering with a strip of black fabric, silently and slowly. And at the end, without using words, we told the story of Jesus' body being taken from the cross, wrapped and carried away, by having two people bring in a large white sheet of fabric, lay it on the floor, take down the black and lay it on the white, fold the white around the black, picking it up in a manner reminiscent of a body carried across their shoulders. And as the choir sang, the body of Christ was carried out between the people, the choir following. And as they did, the sanctuary fell slowly into silence, and the rest of us left without another word spoken. How do we bring the stories and our worship to life on, in, and through our bodies? How are our emotions engaged in worship? Well, a general shape of worship has us move through our modes or moods of prayer, from praise and thanksgiving, through confession, acceptance of forgiveness, to concern for and commitment to our neighbours and our world. But I wonder, how often do we lament together in our worship? Properly, honestly, acknowledging sorrow, anger, longing, despair, with and without reaching hope. Do those who read the Bible aloud in our worship gatherings express emotion of and in response to what they're speaking aloud, so as to move the hearers of our sacred story? Do our preachers infuse their reflections and sermons with emotion, acknowledging that the characters in the stories feel strongly or uncomfortably at times, for them and for us? Do our preachers express their emotions, their feeling of love for their people and for their God, their longing for justice, their sorrow at grief and pain, not so as to centre themselves and make it all about them, but so as to be fully human with their people and encourage us all to do so and be so before God? I was, for around 3 years, the coordinator of an alternative church expression called the Esther Project. Across the length of our seasons, we experimented with a number of different ways to gather, but each time we were seeking to encounter the biblical stories and then respond to them with prayer and creativity. So for a time, our pattern of gathering was fortnightly, and we would take one story and engage with it 3 times over 6 weeks. For the first 2 of those gatherings, we would hear the story and have space to wonder, imagine, talk about it, response with creativity and contemplation. And then we would reimagine the story together and how we wanted to tell it for a 3rd time in a space that would look completely different probably. We started with Esther. Then we moved on to seasonal stories of Christmas, Epiphany, Easter. But the story for which this worked the most beautifully, I think, was Lent 2010. In the first gathering of that season, we heard a poem from Jan Such Pickard called Woman with Ointment. In that poem, she imagines the woman who washes Jesus' feet with perfume, her emotions, and inviting our emotions. Being so taken into the emotional depth of the encounter between her and Jesus, we wondered what the response might be from the perspective of Jesus, who received that gift. And I was asked to take those ponderings and turn them into a poem that would be a companion piece. So at our second gathering for that season, we heard the new poem, Jesus Anointed. We heard his emotions and we responded with ours. These 2 poems and our engagement with them and the story itself connected us to our emotional responses and to the characters. We found their poignancy, the embodied performance of God's story, relationship of love, grief. When we came to retell the story, it took shape around those 2 poems. We curated a Maundy Thursday gathering to which quite a number of people came from around the place. We read the poems one at a time in multiple verses. We sat in silence. We heard the poems again, but interposed alternate verses from each, and again in multiple voices. We passed oil between us and anointed our neighbours with a blessing. Then we removed what elements we had on the central table, and someone representing Jesus knelt beside the table, and the rest of us left the room with him alone. We weren't seeking to manipulate the emotions of those who gathered. We were creating an opportunity for us to honestly feel them, give space to them, and allow that to be our deep encounter with the sacred story, meaningful and an enacted interpretation of the story as it lives on in our communities of faith. That evening is remembered fondly by those who were there for its encounter, for its invitation into sacred encounter. And it's now actually available for others to use in an e-liturgy downloadable from Wild Goose Publications. So if you go to your materials on the website, in the references you'll find information about that if you're interested. How do we bring the stories and our worship to life on and in and through our emotions? And how are our relationships engaged in worship? We pray for others and are commissioned to go out from our worship into the world. We pass the peace, generally with a handshake or a kiss, but at the moment in socially distanced safety. How else are we encouraged to see, really see each other, the people sitting behind, before, beside us, in front of us on a screen? Whose voices do we hear in the stories that are told in our gathered worship? Whose voices do we hear from the pulpit leading us in prayer, song, story? In Australia, I'm conscious in particular of the stories of our Indigenous First Nations people and how I can encourage us to remember them when we gather, to seek those stories out and to really listen. How is the language we use in our prayers and songs, stories and sermons appropriate or alienating for those who gather or might join us for worship? I've mentioned a few times that one of the biggest influences of my audiences on me when I interpret our stories is in language. And one way that influences how I lead worship is that I've begun to write new words to old hymns. I generally take the theme of the original and adapt it or reimagine it in language that's appropriate for today. I know I'm not the first or the only person to do this. I find it important because of the way that songs speak to us emotionally and physically. Singing is a whole person experience, the way that story is really. As a minister within congregations of mixed ages, there are many for whom the old hymns are comfort and a foundation for their faith. And there are many for whom the language is empty at best, or alienating and harmful in its antiquated theological and ideological assumptions. But even for many who like the old songs, of course, their theology has actually grown beyond that which they would sing in those songs. So at some level, subconscious, if not conscious, there's some sort of dissonance going on. John Bell of Iona tells us that the theology, the story that we sing, sits profoundly deeply within us because it is such a whole person experience. So it's really important that leaders help their people to sing a theology that is, to sing the story in a way that is helpful and appropriate. So I write new words to old hymns. This hymn I wrote for Advent and Christmas and was sung last year at Calvary Rochester in Minnesota, where their music director is Brian Williams, and they recorded it for me, so I'm hoping I can share it with you.
The hymn we're about to sing is a new poem titled Beautiful Promise and was composed by the Reverend Dr. Sarah Agnew. Dr. Agnew is a minister, storyteller, and poet from Canberra, Australia. To her knowledge, Calvary is the first church to sing this new hymn in worship.
How do we bring the stories and our worship to life with, alongside, through the stories of our community and our neighbours? Again, the worksheet for those with those questions is in your materials, in the materials online, and I do encourage you to take that and use it with your leaders. You'll see there also a resource for a Bible study in the embodied performance method, because another way we gather together in Christian community is for Bible study, exploring and discussing the Bible in depth and breadth. So I want to explore now with you how embodied performance analysis principles might be applied to this practice as well, to encourage holistic encounters. I do think we can shape our Bible studies in a way to name and explore our physical responses, our emotional responses, and our interpersonal responses. So I'm developing a study guide that employs embodied performance principles. And I'm going to take you through that process with Jonah 3, which is another of our focus stories. And the guide that you'll find online is an exclusive preview of what I hope to publish eventually. So use it and have fun. We begin the process with an opening meditation to connect ourselves with our bodies and our senses, our emotions, and our relationships. So if you'd like to join me in that meditation. We are here with our whole selves. We are here with our whole bodies, bones, muscles, sinews, organs, breath, blood, water. We can feel what clothes us, what holds us. We notice what we may see. We notice what we may hear. We breathe deep and notice the breath in our lungs and what scents we take in. We lick our lips, we swallow, we taste life. We are here with our whole selves. We are here feeling the light, the weight, the shadow of stories we encountered in recent days, the stories we are living. We breathe deep and notice how we feel today, how we are today. We are here with our whole selves. We are here together in one way or another. We may feel bodies beside us. Notice the breathing of others with us. We consider what we know of the stories we are each living, side by side. We are here with our whole selves, welcomed by Holy One, healed by Holy One, whole in Holy One's love and life and story. We are here for the story as we are, bodies, feelings, community. Now we hear the portion read aloud. I'm going to read it rather than tell it. I think most participants, when they're using this guide, will probably read it aloud, but telling it by heart is also excellent for this process. As you listen, I invite you to note what you see in the reader, what you feel from the reader, what you feel yourself, what stories from our time and place, our world, our community are evoked as you listen. And as I read, I will notice where and how my body moves, what emotion I feel and express. If I was with a live gathered audience, I would notice what responses I can see from them. And I will pay attention also to stories of time, place, world, and community. as I speak. Jonah 3. The word of breath of life came to Jonah a second time, saying, "Get up, go to Nineveh, that great city, and proclaim to it the message that I will tell you." So Jonah set out and went to Nineveh, according to the word of breath of life. Now, Nineveh was an exceedingly large city, a 3 days' walk across. Jonah began to go into the city, going a day's walk. And he cried out, 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. And the people of Nineveh believed. They believed Holy One. They proclaimed a fast, and everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. Then he had a proclamation made in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, no human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed, nor shall they drink water. Human beings and animals shall be covered with sackcloth, and they shall cry mightily to God. All shall turn from their evil ways and from the violence that is in their hands. Who knows? Holy One may relent and change their mind. They may turn from their fierce anger so that we do not perish. When Holy One saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, Holy One changed their mind about the calamity that they had said they would bring upon them. And they did not do it. In an embodied performance Bible study, discussion will be framed by the questions that our bodies, emotions pose for us, and that we that arise for ourselves and each other as audience. As I go through each of the three, I'll pose questions slowly so that you can consider them. We're not going to have a chance to discuss it. So I'll just move straight into sharing what I observed through my body and emotions and audience. So the questions we pose of our body: what did the body of the reader seem to say? Did it support or contradict the words? What meaning do you draw from the coherence or incoherence of body and words? What did your body do as you heard the portion aloud? And what did that tell you of your own story? What did it tell you of your history with Jonah 3? What did it tell you of your questions and insights of this portion today? I noticed my body gesture as Holy One told Jonah to get up and go, which drew attention to me to the call to move from where he is. Jonah's quite stuck, isn't he? He needs to move to where his audience is. Movement's a key element of the story of Jonah. So the gestures help, I think, to show me and to show us, the audience, and build a sense of momentum and energy. I heard in my voice as Holy One speaks to Jonah a subtext of, now will you do what I ask? We know from chapter 3 that this is the second time he's been asked, and we know the breadth of the story. We know that he has run away quite drastically before. I used pauses several times. And a pause brings in a sense of stillness in the body, so that can hold us in the moments of the story, and it kind of balances with the movement. But I actually also found the pauses to hold movement within them. They allowed for the story to move between scenes. There were a couple of scenes that followed on from each other that actually needed not to follow immediately on my voice. The first of those was when everyone puts on sackcloth before the word reaches the king. As I was immersed in the story and envisaged that great big city that is 3 days walk across, as we're told, I became aware of that sense of vastness and the time it takes to spread the word. So when I went in rehearsal straight on from sackcloth to and the king heard the word, it felt too fast. It felt like we actually needed to stop and wait for time to move a bit. Then again, after the king's proclamation to the people, his desperate reaching for hope of a different outcome, I again felt if I moved straight from there into and Holy One hears, it was too fast. I needed to stop and hold time in which Holy One has a chance to hear and believe and change their mind. I moved through the king's responsive actions quite slowly. His actions speak his hearing and believing rather than the narrator saying the king hears and believes. We're just shown. So there's a kind of a weight to his actions. They're doing quite a lot. Those were the things I noticed my body telling me, some of the things that my body told me the story meant. Questions we ask of our emotional response. What impact does Jonah 3 have on you? As you heard it read, can you name what you feel? What do your emotions lead you to understand? Firstly, about the portion, about Jonah 3. What do they lead you to understand about yourself? What do they lead you to understand about God or Holy One? I encourage you to explore your range of emotions without judging right or wrong. And when you're gathered with people in groups, be curious about the differences in the feelings between you. There's no right or wrong. We do need to consider which emotions reflect our own stories, which reflect our past encounters with Jonah 3, and which emotions reflect our shared community stories and experiences. And we might consider which emotions for the characters seem to fit within an authentic range of possibilities, which takes us into my first observation. I felt quite a fire and brimstone judgmental tone to Jonah's proclamation of the message of Holy One, because from the broader story, we know he wants this to come true. As we go on into, well, his first running away was, but they might relent. They might repent and you might relent. I don't want to tell them, don't want to give him a chance not to be punished. And we know he's going to have a tantrum a bit later on. So when you're telling a portion from within a broader story, knowing the emotional journey, I suppose, the development of the character before you get to the portion you're telling and afterwards is important to pitch it right, I think. I felt quite some fear in the proclamation from the king, that hyperbole, humans and animals will all fast and all wear sackcloth, seemed to be an exaggeration that's born of fear, really pointed to their desperation. And you also get the desperate reaching for hope at the end. Who knows? Maybe Holy One will relent. I felt that the narrator was happy, or at least neutral, when Holy One turns from the anticipated overthrowing of Nineveh. But it is a surprise. And it took me a few readings in rehearsal to feel the surprise again. When we know the story really well, we know where it's going, we can kind of forget to be surprised. So that's why I really encourage in a group study like this, for those who are going to be the one to read it aloud, to be given that role ahead of time, so they've got time to rehearse, get the story on your breath, into your body, to feel it, so that you can get into the depth of the story and let go of it, let it carry you along as if for the first time. That's the beauty of story, isn't it? To be immersed in it, so that each time you hear it, it's like hearing it for the first time. We can know the content and structure of a story, but that's really different to being immersed in it, embodying it, and feeling it. We need to be immersed in it enough so that we can be carried by the story and surprised by it. So considering from the perspective of audience, you're in the position of audience for this study. So how did the portion speak to you personally? How did you hear it speak to your community and to our world today? You might consider how that has remained the same from your past encounters with the portion, or has it changed meaning? Does it seem to speak differently today to how it spoke to you when you were a child? I learnt to look at it slightly differently when I worked with Liz Bowes on a trauma reading of Jonah. That the trauma of Jonah's people in their past experiences with the people of Nineveh might be part of what shapes his responses. So there's always different learning, different experiences that will change how we meet the story today. Are there commentaries or other scholarship works that can help you see the similarities and differences between how Jonah 3 is speaking today and how it might have been received by its earliest audiences? And how does the language work for you as receivers of Jonah 3? Are there words or phrases you'd change so that you can hear the nuance or allusions or word plays differently? Is there something in the language? I mean, I essentially read an NRSV translation there. So is there something in the English of that translation that doesn't quite work in the English as it's developed from then to now? So again, we've seen a number of times in the 2 sessions already that the way that audience influences me in interpretation is very often in the language that I use. So for most audiences today, I change the divine names. I've talked about that a bit already. If we're going to move beyond the patriarchal systems of our world, we've got to be diligent and persistent. So I find that the way we name the divine can carry a lot of baggage, and I like to kind of just push at that a bit, challenge that a bit, and see if I can free us from that so that we can encounter God differently. So I've used Holy One again instead of God, and Breath of Life instead of the Lord, which is what I talked about doing in the translation of Micah 6 in session 1. I did wonder about sackcloth and ashes. It's quite symbolic action pointing to mourning, and it may not be in the cultural capital of audiences today. For you, mostly being biblical storytellers, I thought your biblical knowledge would probably be quite deep and broad, and that you would have encountered plenty of stories with sackcloth and ashes in it, so I wouldn't need to add a line. But for a different audience, maybe particularly younger audiences, I might add a line in, you know, they clothed themselves in sackcloth because they were mourning, you know, to show that they were mourning. And you could then talk about it afterwards, but in the moment of the story, so that you don't lose them because they don't know what's going on, to just add a note to bridge the gap in cultural capital. In a Bible study that draws on embodied performance tools, once you've examined how your body, emotions and audience are showing you meaning in the story, the next thing to do is to reflect on that, to look at the breadth of responses amongst the group, the possibilities for interpretation and meaning, to sort of collate that, and then think about what choices you would make for posture, movement, gesture and voice, for emotional tone and range, for intonation, translation or comment when you're mediating this portion by reading it aloud for listeners today. So within the session of this Bible study, you most of the group are positioned as audience, and then in critical reflection you're invited to then come back and look at it from the perspective of the performer interpreter, and what would you do, or what would you do differently next time. I'm not going to go through a critical reflection of Jonah 3. I'm actually going to leave that with you to do. See what conclusions you might draw. As I said, the study guide is available with the materials on the Festival Gathering page on the website. And I invite you to have a play with it. For this portion, sit down after you've watched this session and do the critical reflection, or do a different one with a group. In our next session, our final session, I'm going to then move even further into our lowercase embodied performance, our enacting of the story of God, and think about how we can encourage our people to tell our personal stories, tell them well, as a way of telling the story of God in which we are invited to participate. So I'll see you then. And before that, as in our first session, I will pray with a prayer poem that responds to Jonah 3, as is my practice with Pray the Story. God awaits our return. We come to God, God's people, confess our turning away. We come to God, God's people, welcomed back anyway. We are Jonah. We do not want to go. We are Nineveh. We do not want to know. We are Jonah. We think the others unworthy. We are Nineveh, unaware of our deep yearning. We are Jonah, met by God each time we flee. We are Nineveh, reminded at last we see. We are Jonah, we are Nineveh. We have returned, wronged you and repented. We come to God, God's people, confess our turning away. We come to God, God's people, welcomed back anyway. Hear this, kin in God's family. God calls us. God seeks us. God loves us. God forgives us. Keep returning. God is waiting. Amen.